Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to the LJ Ranke Travel Channel. I am here at Norway Lutheran Church, rural Denbigh, North Dakota. I'd like to spend a little time this morning talking to you about this church building itself. I'd like to talk to you about the cemetery on the south side of the road, one of the most beautiful rural cemeteries I have ever seen, beautifully maintained. I'd like to talk to you about the man whose name is now associated with this cemetery, who is quite a famous resident of this cemetery. I'd like to talk to you about his wife, and I'd like to just talk about life. So bear with me here, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, Norway Lutheran Church, the building that you see behind me, was built in 1907. It's made of Denbigh sand brick, which was manufactured by the Denbigh Brick Company, which went out of business in 1917. What's notable is that as a rural church, it's built out of brick. That's unusual. Most rural country churches are wood frame buildings. This building eventually was registered on the National Site for Historic Places, and so it is a registered historic site, beautifully maintained. When you pass Highway 2, we're about 10 miles south of Denbigh, which is on Highway 2. When you pass Denbigh, you'll notice on the north side of the highway the old Denbigh School, no longer used, but it's been purchased by a gentleman from Ohio who spends time there, and so that school is in good repair. But it's notable that it is also made of the same white brick from the Denbigh Brick Company. The church is, I can only give huge amounts of praise to the trustees of this property. This church is beautifully maintained. Well, now it's the week of July 4th, and the lawn is well maintained. The cemetery also has been mowed, and it's a beautiful cemetery. I've never seen a cemetery like this, ladies and gentlemen, in that kind of from the southwest quadrant, you're looking to the south right now. As you look into on your screen. From about the center of the cemetery, the property drops down in a diagonal pattern down to the northwest corner of the property into a ravine. It's just a beautiful piece of property and so well maintained. And you can see the gate there that says Norway Lutheran. I'm so impressed with the people who manage this property. There are 2 outhouses out back. There are weather shelters in front of each outhouse as to give you some privacy and also block the wind. But you go in there, there are 2 coffee cans with rolls of toilet paper in them. Now let me tell you what, when we travel, just because you never know what you're going to find when you go to rural places, we travel with a box of Kleenex. You can tell it's all messed up. Box of Kleenex is a traveler's best friend, let me tell you what, because you never know when you might need some Kleenex just in case there's no toilet paper. But still, it was just wonderful to see this church. You cannot get into it, and people no longer worship here, but it is a beautiful facility. The gentleman who's buried here, what brought this to my attention is I was at the Scandinavian Heritage Park in Minot, and there's a statue of a man named Sondre Norheim, S-O-N-D-R-E. He's considered the father of skiing. And I thought, okay, Norwegian, father of skiing, Scandinavian Heritage Park, that makes sense. But if you look at the plaque, it says he's buried in Denbigh, North Dakota. Wait a minute, the father of skiing from Norway, buried in North Dakota? What is that all about? Well, I did a little digging, and what you discover is that he was born in an area of Norway where there, of course, was skiing, but it was mostly cross-country skiing. There was a little bit of downhill, but not a lot. But what he did, he was a farmer, but he was also a carpenter. And he developed a binding. Originally, skis were only bound to your boots by the toes. He developed a binding that looped around your heel, keeping the heel and the toe above the ski together, which allowed much more maneuverability. And he also developed certain techniques for turning that we would now know as slalom, but they were called the telemark, and they were called the Christiana method of turning, which kept your skis parallel. Nobody else had done that. So he developed a binding, and he developed a method of skiing which nobody else had done, which really introduced the new concept of downhill skiing. He was also a jumper, and in the first sort of national jump contest in Norway, he took first place by a mile. People saw him ski and they realized this was a completely new way of skiing. So he's remembered as the father of skiing. What's interesting is his name was not initially Norheim. His original name was, let me write, I've got this written down here, hold on just a second. His original name was Sondre Alverson. What I did not know is that Scandinavian surnames, or at least Norwegian surnames, at least in many instances, that the last name was actually your father's first name with the word son or daughter put behind it. So his father's name was Alver, so Sondre's name was Sondre Alverson. So he eventually bought a different piece of property, multiple properties, but one piece of property was called the Norheim Farm, and so he took the name Norheim for himself, and that is the name by which he's remembered today as Sondre Norheim. That was his name when he emigrated to the United States. His wife, when he met her, her name was Rennai, spelled R-A-N-N-E-I, and her name was Amund's daughter, D-O-T-T-E-R, as in the daughter of Amund. So it's interesting how those surnames, I had the son or daughter of the father's first name, and that's how those surnames were established. Now, I'm not sure how universal was that practice, but it certainly was a common practice. And evidently, changing your name was also a relatively common practice to do. I don't fully understand that process, I'll tell you that. Sondre and Rennai had 8 children. And this is kind of a sad part of the story. They were in Norway, had 8 children. Their second daughter, at age 15 weeks, died. One of their other children, a boy, at age 12, also died. Now, he farmed, and I assume the situation was difficult. So eventually, at age 59, he had 2 older children, a daughter who was married, and a son who had already emigrated to the United States. And at age, he was 59, his wife was the same age, maybe actually just a little bit older than he was. They decided to emigrate with their 3 children that they had at home. A 4th, the oldest daughter at home, decided she was going to stay in Norway. So they bade farewell to their daughter in Norway and emigrated to the United States. Again, this is not a young man, he's 59 years old. They first came to Minnesota and were not there very long, and they ended up in Denbigh, North Dakota, or actually the township here south of Denbigh. At the time they came here, this church was not in existence. There had been a log church. In fact, let me show you the cemetery. There is a pyramid here in this cemetery. Do you see that pyramid there? That marks the spot of what had been the log church. However, at the time that he arrived, or very soon after, that church, I don't know what happened to it. It was not here all that long. But there was a period between that log church, if you look at the marker, when they stopped using it, and the construction of the church that you've seen already, the white brick church. At the time that Sondre was here, neither building was in existence. So I don't know the story there as to where people worshipped after that log church was no longer used. Maybe another rural church, or maybe they met in people's homes, because that certainly happened a lot as well. But they lived in North Dakota, and can you imagine, here was a ski champion of Norway living in North Dakota. People, in the late 1800s, where are you going to go skiing? Cross country, certainly there's snow, but there was no, there's certainly no downhill skiing to take advantage of, not in this part of the country, unless it's just a simple little hill. He was eventually buried here. His wife, after his death, moved to Oregon, and this is kind of a sad part of the story. I don't know her whole history there, but she ended up eventually in the state hospital in in Salem, Oregon. And she died at age 88. Some people think she had Alzheimer's, but it was a mental hospital where she died. And at the time, the practice was that they buried mental health patients there, or the state hospital patients, there on the grounds. The state then decided to stop burying people there. So they contacted families and said, you need to, we will exhume the bodies and you need to relocate them. If families did not relocate the bodies of their loved ones there, they cremated the remains that they'd dug up, and all of those remains were put into copper jars, a copper a lid, a container, and they were on shelves, and all their names were put on them. That is what happened to Rennai. She ended up, her remains were dug up at the hospital. She was cremated, and her remains were put in one of those copper tins. But that whole reservoir, that whole storage room was forgotten. Years later, it was rediscovered. And the 1,000 containers that were in there, all the labels had fallen off. Nobody knew whose remains were in what jar. So her remains have not been identified to this day. There is now, at his grave, at Sondre's grave, there's a marker commemorating her life as well, but her remains are not here because her remains could never be identified when they were found in, all those remains were found in Oregon. Now, what's all this have to do with anything? Ladies and gentlemen, it's life. Traveling is about exploring the world and seeing what's out there and being curious about what's out there. But it's also about regarding each other as a means of discovery. You look at the lives of Sondre and Rennai. They lost a 15-week-old. They lost a 12-year-old. They emigrated to another country. They said goodbye to a daughter who stayed in Norway. They lived without any fame here in North Dakota. He was acknowledged, by the way, at 3 different Winter Olympics as being the father of modern-day skiing. And she died alone in a hospital in Oregon. My suggestion, ladies and gentlemen, is, and it's a sad story, and now here's this church that was built, and now nobody worships here again. There's a lot of sadness in this story. There's a lot of wonderful things too, but the log church is gone. The stone church, or the brick church, which is beautiful, is no longer has worshipers in it. What do we do with all of this? Life is so transient, so changing, so ending. Now, I could go really spiritual on you here. I'm not going to. But I'm going to go human with you. As a traveler, look at the people around you and love them. Our stories merge for a little while, then our stories end. There are joys, there are victories, but there are also many, many losses. And in the process of loving, please let me offer this request. In order to love, ask the people around you about themselves. Listen. Many of us don't have people to listen to our stories. Many of us have known victories and joys and losses, but we find that people don't listen. So, today on this travel channel, I would ask you to look at the people around you and begin to ask them their stories. What are your pains? What are your joys? Where does it hurt? What makes you laugh? And to listen. Sometimes when we listen, we find things we don't want to hear, and we might have to say, I'm not so sure about that. But first, let us listen, and let us love by listening. Thank you for being with me at Norway Lutheran Church and letting me go on and on about living and loving and serving and saying goodbye. Because you look at this church, and you look at the cemetery, and you see goodbyes here. Hellos, but goodbyes. So until we make our final goodbye, let us love and let us serve. Thank you. Goodbye. And God bless.